Before starting the interview, would you allow me to ask about your career adventure? You are known as one of the founding fathers of constructivism in international relations. I wonder how and when did you decide to work on it? Any memories would be appreciated.
Early in my scholarly career, I had focused on theoretical issues in international law, including the time-honored question, is international law truly law? I paid particular attention to the sources of international law, and thus to the underlying criteria of the effectiveness and validity of sources as legal rules themselves. By the late 1970s, I had distilled my understanding of the relevant processes into this formula: law is what lawyers say it is, and that goes most conspicuously for international law and international lawyers. Looking back, one can see this sociological stance as inchoately constructivist. While I worked on theoretical issues in international law, I also devoted a great deal of attention to theory in the field of international relations, then dominated by political realists, who had little or no respect for international law and international institutions, despite the conceptually sophisticated work of younger liberal scholars, such as Stanley Hoffman, Ernst Haas, Joseph Nye, Robert Cohen, John Ruggie, and Aran Young. Although I counted myself in this camp, by the 1970s I had become disenchanted with liberal ideas about institutional progress, integration, and reform, not to mention disciplinary parochialism, and I seriously explored Western Marxist social theory. In particular, I came to appreciate the pervasiveness of domination in human affairs. I also sought to reconcile the evident materiality of the human condition with the equally evident subjectivity of human experience, a philosophical issue Marxism brings to the fore but realism misconstrues and liberalism wrongly writes off. I realized that society is the necessary middle term in this equation, and then that language is indispensable means by which society mediates material existence and human experience, in the process making society what it is. In the 1980s, I immersed myself in the postmodern movement, with an emphasis on the so-called linguistic turn. Wittgenstein, Foucault, and Habermas variously stimulated my conceptual awareness. At the same time, my feminist doctoral students pushed me to think about the social content of taken-for-granted concepts like gender. Drawing on my earlier work on rules, norms by another name, I gradually worked out a system of relations between kinds of performative speech, assertions, orders, promises, kinds of rules, instruction rules, directive rules, commitment rules, and conditions of rule, domination reconceptualized as hegemony, hierarchy, heteronomy, applicable to every society, including international society. A decade of work came to fruition in 1989 with publication of World of Our Making, in which I used the term constructivism to characterize what was distinctive and important about the undertaking. The book's subtitle, Rules and Rules in Social Theory and International Relations, points to the joint emphasis on rules grounded in language and rule operationalized through rules. Most readers then and since have picked up on the importance of rules for social construction, but not on the importance of rule, even in an allegedly anarchic international society. This response hardly surprised me, since many younger scholars, especially in the US, were looking for ways to reconceptualize liberal institutionalism after the Cold War ended. By the time scholars elsewhere began to explore constructivism grounded in language, Western Marxism had faded away, post-structuralists were fetishizing Carl Schmitt, and my emphasis on conditions of rule failed to resonate. I am happy to report that there is now a renewed interest in rule, hierarchy, most of all, but it is little influenced by what I had to say more than 30 years ago. Not that I surprised.
In one of your book chapter, Constructivism, a User's Manual, you state that all the ways in which people deal with rules, whether we follow the rules or break them, whether we make the rules, change them, or get rid of them, may be called practices. Based on this making and developing rules, could you please evaluate the process works, from people to international relations?
People cannot be dissociated, practically or conceptually, from the social arrangements that enable them to act in, and upon, the world. Everyone is an agent, however limited in degree. Everyone's world, however confined, is replete with institutions, manifest in rules instructing them in what to expect, directing them what to do, and securing their complicity in what is going to happen. Agency itself is a function of rules conferring specific statuses, offices, and roles on designated human persons, thereby authorizing, or empowering, such persons to act on behalf of some agent or institution, including oneself. By metaphorical extension, an institution, on behalf of which designated agents are authorized to act, is itself an agent or person. In this respect, a state, such as Turkey, is an institution and has personality in international law. The state's agents act on behalf of the state, acting on behalf of the state's constituent population, including those agents of the state. Such agents themselves constitute an institutional complex routinely called a government. Let me use myself as an example of how to put this frame of reference to use. I am an elderly male scholar. These three statuses, among many others, assure that many other agents listen to me and secure me considerable respect. I am a citizen of the United States who pays taxes and votes. These duties derive from a state-authorized office and give me a small place at the bottom of a so-called chain of command. I hold legal rights and duties equally held by other agents, for example, the right to sign a valid contract under municipal law combined with a duty to carry out the terms of that contract, the right to speak freely under the U.S. Constitution, the right to life, liberty and security of person, stipulated in Article 3 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Because my rights constitute others' duties, and their rights my duties, we all have comparable roles in relation to each other. This is the case at every level of social relations. As most scholars would put it, I would prefer to say, in every substantive domain of social relations. Formalized in the principle of the sovereign equality, the same logic of rights and duties holds for such states as Turkey and the United States in their relations. In the case of states like Turkey and the US, their formal relations as equals constitute what I have been calling international society. For the most part, government agents organized into chains of command conduct these relations. Scholars in the field of international relations give most of their attention to these agents and their relations. There are, however, other domains of relations to bear in mind. Obviously, states-authorized agents often fail to treat each other as equals in their substantive relations, and they call on a wide variety of resources, materialized through rules, including other kinds of agents, to achieve their goals. To the considerable extent that states benefit disproportionately from their access to other domains over lengthy periods of time, and this access is effectuated through a mighty assemblage of rules, the result is a condition of rule within international society. It follows then that some of my statuses, offices, and roles fall into the substantive domain we conventionally call international relations because they bear on how states act, and agents function, in relation to other states, and their agents. Thus my status as a scholar means that when I give an interview, what I am saying may reach the ears of agents more directly empowered to act on behalf of states. Those agents may even treat me as a resource. That I am a theorist works against my relevance to what goes on in the name of international relations, because most people in government think theory is too abstract to help them in their day-to-day conduct. Consider this interview a case in point. Before I retired as a professor and thus as an academic officer with the power to assign grades and determine futures, I had some direct impact on students who were themselves state agents or would become state agents. Since then, most of the statuses, offices, and roles making me a person, a social being, do not fall into the substantive domain of international relations, at least most of the time. This is obviously true for most people. By contrast, some offices, for example, the Presidency of Turkey or the United States, guarantee that the acts of incumbent officers and many of their designated subordinates fall within the substantive domain of international relations most of the time. I should also point out that the boundaries between domains are porous. Metaphorically speaking, dams always leak, floods occasionally spill over them. To illustrate the point, a merchant in Wuhan's wet market rightfully selling meat is performing a role, and the customer whose duty it is to pay for the meat at an agreed price is performing a complementary role. We can safely say that this transaction has no relevance to international relations. Yet billions of routine transactions like this make China's economy what it is, and China's economy is a resource that agents of the Chinese state use in their relations with agents of other states. Once in a great while, a routine transaction in one domain unexpectedly overwhelms other domains. Recently, an utterly routine transaction in Wuhan's wet market unleashed a virus that has had devastating repercussions all over the world, many of them obviously relevant to international relations. It should be clear that, theoretically speaking, a rule-oriented frame of reference applies to all social relations. It is not, however, a theory. It does not make substantive generalizations about any domain of social relations. Nor does it indicate how, or when, domains affect each other substantively or come to be seen as separate and autonomous.
States are also what people have made throughout history, but sometimes they could go for a domestic or a foreign policy that people do not agree with. Could you please explain two ways of construction either in domestic or foreign policies?
Implicit in this question is what I would call a methodological concern. To use a familiar formula, constructivists have long insisted that agents and structures are co-constitutive. In this context, agents are usually construed as human individuals. Despite what I say above, structure is a notional property of systems, hence I prefer institution, which, like agents, are rule-defined. The standard language of agents and structures reproduces the so-called level of analysis problem, an ontological issue with methodological implications. Does one start an inquiry at the unit level, or the aggregate? With the state or the system of states? With agents' choices or the system's constraints? Does one add things up and break them down, piece by piece, or does one embrace the whole? The first way leads to descriptively rich case studies favored by students of foreign policy, while the second way leads to abstract generalizations, or theories, about the ways that structurally differentiated kinds of systems work. Constructivists say there is a third way. The co-constitution of agents and structures is a process. Constitution is also a condition, a snapshot of the state of social relations. At any given moment, social reality is never fixed or constant. Thus we can start with process, which would seem to imply that we seek to identify ever-changing causal sequences. Methodologically, this is tricky business, all the more because the causal sequences run in both directions. Agents make structures what they are, structures make agents what they are. And it is here that many constructivists are defeated by the conceptual complexity of their constructions, to the point of claiming that constitutive processes cannot be broken down into their causal constituents. Alexander Wendt is an example. In my view, this stance is simply wrong. Even if causal sequences demarcate change by definition, a change in X causes a change in Y, converging causal sequence can offset rather than reinforce changes in both sequences, and they frequently do. Sites of multiple convergences appear to be stable from an observer's perspective. The sand on a beach changes constantly even as the beach looks pretty much the same day after day. If we talk about function, processes oriented towards some end, then complexity is even greater, along with stable patterns of causal relations. And we must talk about function if we are going to talk about social relations. We do just this whenever we use the language of doing, using, making or working. Rules encapsulate, actualize, effectuate this kind of language that fulfills the potential of modal auxiliaries. Rules say, this is where, when, how, we, you, they, can, should, must, do, use, make, such and so. This is what may, can, would, happen if you do not. All the ways in which people deal with rules, whether we follow the rules or break them, whether we make the rules, change them, or get rid of them, are co-constitutive processes, mediating human choice and institutional constraints. Every time an agent follows a rule, or breaks it, the rule itself is strengthened, or weakened, for the next agent who chooses to follow that rule, or not. The rule is never simply there, despite appearances. To summarize, rules harness causation, they do not replace it. Co-constitutive processes turn ought into is, and is into ought, if only for a time. As rules, institutionalized oughts carries the weight of rule.
From a constructivist perspective, the anarchic nature of international relations is also constructed, and it is distinctive from chaos. Defining state sovereign means they do not have to abide someone else's rules, but post-structuralists, neo-realists and neoliberals emphasize the international order, political and economic conditions and claim that they do not leave options but abiding specific rules. Could you please elaborate on the difference between the international conditionality and construction of these certain conditions? Thus, what makes constructivism a separate international relations theory might be revealed.
I have dealt with the question of the force of rules, the extent to which agents feel compelled to do what rules say, in my response to the previous question, though briefly. The normative force of rules is such that we follow them most of time ceteris paribus. We, as agents, choose to do so because we benefit materially and subjectively. Not actively choosing is a choice. The term follow allows for this ambiguity. We internalize rules and follow them reflexively. We even follow rules we learned as children instructing us to follow rules. Agents can always choose not to follow any given rule in any given circumstance, or try to change the rule, and so on, always in anticipation of the consequences stipulated by rules complementing the rule in question. Sovereign states routinely abide by most of the rules they have collectively constructed for themselves, not just the formal rules they call international law, but also a large variety of informal rules that work for them. Realists like to emphasize the occasions in which states' agents choose not to abide by this or that rule, typically offering what they call compelling reasons for doing so. Who would deny that there are such occasions, and that they matter a great deal? Liberal institutionalists emphasize the ordered pattern of social relations that emerge when agents follow thick blankets of rules that favor their joint needs and interests. Who would deny the extent of such ordered patterns in the social relations of every domain, including international relations? Honoring a Marxist legacy, many post-structuralist and post-colonial scholars emphasize resistance to conditions of rule, given the asymmetric consequences of following rules in place. While the beneficiaries of standing social arrangements tend to resist resistance and counter violence with violence, who can deny that resistance results in new patterns of rules and altered conditions of rule? Constructivists can accommodate all such emphases, and their normative underpinnings, because the kind of rule-oriented constructivism I have endorsed in this interview is not a theory, as I pointed out above, and it does not require any particular normative stance to justify its use as a frame of reference.
Following your footsteps in constructivism, there have been many studies working on constructivist agents ranging from individuals, social movements, elites to international organizations. Do you think that these studies are in favor of constructivism or just going around the core assumption that value-centered people are making our world? I am asking this because of that most of them implies and try to prove that constructivism as a separate international relations theory.
As I suggested earlier, many self-styled constructivists are liberal institutionalists in disguise. They are disposed to valorize the individuality and autonomy of every human being, operationalized as freedom of choice. I have already pointed out that this so-called right is simultaneously a duty. Right and duties together limit choice and foster the condition of rule I call heteronomy. Some relatively few, materially well-endowed societies are liberal in this sense, but they are also institutionalized as, and protected by, territorially demarcated chains of offices, states. By virtue of comparable rules, stipulating sovereign equality, states themselves constitute a heteronomous society. By implication, realists share with liberals a common perspective on anarchic, international society. They differ in the degree to which they believe that anarchy, heteronomy in international society meets planetary needs. As deep-down liberal institutionalists, many self-styled constructivists do not think that heteronomy should operate unhindered, and they often favor functionally delimited offices, international regimes, to assure a modicum of cooperation in providing public goods. They also advocate rules generalizing human rights, again supported by offices. There is little consistency in these initiatives, which liberals justify in the name of pluralism and constructivists implicitly acknowledge by shifting emphasis from legal rules to informal norms. If there is any theory to this brand of constructivism, it's the old liberal argument that peace and prosperity are co-institutive.
I know that you have been looking at constructivism from a theoretical perspective, but would you please allow me to ask a question which might contain a practical perspective? It is about the discussion of shaking pillars of liberal international order. States' intervention in the market, the refugee crisis, lack of cooperation for global issues, etc., all these are believed to be menacing the order. If you agree with this discussion, how would you respond it through constructivism prism? If do not, why?
I have already addressed the character of the so-called international order and its liberal premises, your pillars, I think, from a constructivist perspective. To address the challenges now shaking that order, it is necessary to comment on capitalism as a system for accumulating wealth, building physical plant, extracting resources, marshalling technical skills, producing valued goods, encouraging the consumption of those same goods, and disposing of the waste from all of these activities. Capitalism is social construction on a colossal scale. Its regenerative properties are unprecedented in human history, its concentration of wealth in ever fewer hands terrifying, its dependence on unfettered liberalism and the support of states made wealthy through capitalism is all too obvious. Capital has made the modern world what it is. Its agents, its uses, its imperatives have eventuated in a materially integrated, socially, functionally and territorially differentiated, utterly vulnerable system of social relations from which none of us can escape. Constructivism encourages us to think about social relations first by reference to processes accounting for relatedness, and then by reference to differentiated densities of relations, and their relations. We often use the language of systems, and their structures, functions, processes, and boundaries, when we do so, but we should always remember that systems are observers' constructs that take on the properties of social constructions, rules, agents, institutions, resources, when observers, as agents, act on, and thereby actualize, what they think they see. I think it is conceptually useful to think of capitalism as a system that is sufficiently autonomous, from an observer's point of view, that large changes in it have cascading effects on the totality of social relations making up the modern world. In my view, capitalism has run its course. Its generative power, manifest in centuries of exponential material growth, has finally exceeded the carrying capacity of the planet. We have run out of cheap technological fixes. We have already begun to a trajectory of exponential downgrowth. Social unrest will increase dramatically. Desperate state agents will join forces with functional experts to authorize digital surveillance, mind-numbing entertainments, and the pharmaceutical pacification of noisy, unhappy publics. Dystopian novels have pointed to this eventuality for decades. Climate change is so widely seen as the large cause for this systemic crisis and impending collapse that any additional authorizing would seem to be superfluous. A constructivist perspective encourages observers to think of themselves as agents capable of bringing about major changes, but that perspective also makes it clear how difficult it will be to carry off such changes. Because the liberal international order was constructed by innumerably many agents to foster and then manage growth, not decline, that order is now part of the problem, and not one easily remedied.
Leading norms, or as you prefer to call it, rules, in the world has had Western origins. Relying on your answer to the previous question, do you believe that any alternative leading norms or rules are being constructed anywhere in the world?
My answer to the previous question drew attention to the scale and exigencies of the modern world. Thanks to relentless capital-driven globalization, the characteristic rules of modern social life have permeated every society on the planet. No village-dotted countryside is exempt. Turkish society is an obvious case in point. Yet traditional ways have not disappeared, even in self-styled modern societies. In my view, the hallmark of any traditional society is the importance of status in the conferral of agency, instruction rules emphasizing appearances, decorum and honor, and institutionalized status ordering as the primary modality of rule. We the beneficiaries of modernity, my interviewers, many readers, think we have put tradition behind us. We are deceiving ourselves. A stagnant economy and increasingly concentrated wealth in my own society seems to have prompted the revival or invention of tradition. Make America Great Again is a revealing slogan. Yet, in my view, even more important is the rise of institutions assigned specialized tasks, the proliferation of expertise, and status ordering of experts by reference to credentials, specialties, employers, and honors, all allegedly keyed to achievement rather than ascription. This is modernist hegemony. Because it appears to be socially progressive, problem-oriented, and relatively blind to traditional ascription by way of race, gender, and family ties, it is much favored by those who seek an alternative to the remnants of tradition now erupting everywhere. I would suggest that functional administration may well suit a world in decline, but it is hardly free of status preoccupations. Achievement becomes indistinguishable from traditional modes of ascription, anywhere, everywhere.
I hope you forgive me because of one more question about the practical world. Based on your lifetime experience and theoretical expertise, would you give us a particular example of that constructivism provides a better and meaningful explanation, but other mainstream theories do not or fall short?
There is a division of labor, so to speak, in the field of international relations. Realists own high politics, liberal internationalists own low politics. Post-structuralists have assumed ownership of critique from Marxists. Feminists, environmentalists, public health specialists, scholars focusing refugees, immigration, terrorism, cyber warfare, intelligence, all these and more have carved out substantive domains for themselves, as did regional specialists at an earlier time. There is no real estate not accounted for, no turf to which constructivists could assert a compelling ownership claim. This state of affairs does not trouble me at all, because the kind of constructivism I have outlined here finds purchase anywhere in the field and enhances any and all theoretical orientations. It does the most clearly by reminding scholars that change is constant in social relations everywhere, but that rates and patterns of change are not. Scholars in the field failed to anticipate the collapse of the Soviet Union, but this event sparked some young scholars to take an interest in constructivism, which was just then undergoing its early, important development in the field.
Decolonization waves, nationalist independence movements and the dissolution of the Soviet Union have caused the emergence of new states. Most of them became center of national, regional and then international conflicts, such as Latin American, African, Middle Eastern and Balkan states. Do you think that it is because of that they do not have their own historical and indigenous rules and systemic values? Your focus on agents creating rules, creating new rules and then social institutions or constitutions are created might bring an explanation to this question.
One might think an emphasis on rules and rule would preclude any sustained consideration of conflict. It should be clear by now that I do not share this sentiment. Conflict is a ruled activity, rules often collide, violence is rarely random. In this interview, I have elaborated on the many ways in which rules impede change, foster change, and change themselves in the process. Often rules seem not to change at all, but, as I have argued, this is an illusion. Often, in aggregate, rules seem to change slowly or at regularized intervals, and this is what liberal Democrats want to see. Less often, rules meet with sustained, massive resistance. Newly empowered agents replace rules with new ones, and therefore new conditions of rule, on such a scale that observers speak of revolutions. After World War II, the collapse of the old imperial order combined with globalization has been just such a revolution, or sequence of overlapping revolutions. One especially useful way to sketch out this revolution is to map shifting sites of agency, and their relation to surviving patterns of rules and conditions of rule. I have always been interested in the interpenetration of global and local elites. This is an interest brought on by dependency theory many decades ago. As a constructivist, I would now formulate the process of reciprocal value penetration as co-constitutive. It has eventuated in what I regard as a revolutionary constitutive development. The global elite now consists of mobile, globalized local elites, all of whom share in a condition of rule, modernist hegemony effectuated locally and globally through functional administrative apparatuses, alienating them from local norms and resurgent localized agency. I am talking about us, our values, our nostalgia for lost worlds, as we rule this world to suit ourselves.
The last question is going to be about recent coronavirus crisis in the world. There are already opinion pieces about the post-corona world in economic and political terms. What would you think about it? Does this global pandemic construct a new way of protectionist thinking and practices in international relations?
I have already suggested that the capitalist world economy has reached its apex and begun a downward trajectory that may turn into a collapse. The pandemic is certain to trigger a deep economic depression on a global scale, from which recovery may not be possible. At the same time, large numbers of adversely affected people will blame state agents and functional elites in every domain for mismanaging the pandemic and its socio-economic consequences. This is a recipe for a downward spiral. Co-constituted publics become ever more battered and enraged, agents empowered to solve worsening problems on every scale fail again and again to turn things around. At worst, rules will be subject to rapid change and may lose some of the normative force we take for granted, conditions of rule will be unstable, material welfare will decline drastically, domains of social relations will lose the institutional functional properties by which we identify them, territorially defined states will crash and burn. International relations will disappear into a chaos of increasingly localized social relations, warlords will fight it out over large swaths of the Earth, as they have so often in the past. At best, climate change will have been arrested, material scarcity will dominate daily lives, fewer people will live fewer years, democracies will break down, but modest republics may take shape here and there, modernity will be forgotten, never to be repeated.
I would like to thank you for the sincere answers and would like to have your closing comments since it is not possible to cover everything in a short interview.
I am grateful for the opportunity, the privilege, of responding to your thoughtful questions in a way that, I hope, honors the intelligence of your readers. In my answers, I have not indulged my ongoing interest in providing constructivism with suitably robust philosophical foundations. Instead, I have tried to link constructivism to another long-standing interest of mine, which is the unfolding of the modern world over 5 centuries. My most recent book treats these two interests as converging projects, although the book says relatively about constructivism as an explicit frame of reference. In this interview, I have tried to remedy this oversight, at least with respect to the world situation as I see it today. As I wind down my scholarly career, this interview may indeed be my last stab at making sense of the world we have made for ourselves, the modern world.